This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Okay, so yes, I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Dawn Como, and I worked on this guidebook with my colleagues, Professors Milier Derbu and Damon Haley-Mariam, who's not, they may be joining at some point, but I also know that they're in the middle of a conference for some of the programs that led to this book. So I know they wanted to join, and they might be here at some point if they're not already on the call, while also juggling their in-person sessions at their conference that they have going on right now in Addis. So I am faculty here at Emory University in the School of Public Health with a secondary appointment in the School of Medicine. And I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of my time thinking about mentoring with colleagues in Ethiopia. And I'm going to start today by just giving you a little bit of a background on how this book was developed and what influenced it. I think that's really important. And also just to say that I'm very passionate about this area, so I'm happy to have your questions. Please write them down and keep track of them so we can get them to them at the end. I believe you all have a copy of the PDF, and I will share with you additional ways to get the text if for some reason you want to share it by other means. And I should also say that we've done some of this work with a program in Cambodia, as well as the country of Georgia, and also right here in the US. So this is something that's happening, I think, throughout many countries, even though I'm talking about it, how it arrived in an Ethiopian context today. So, I think maybe I lost control of moving the slides. Is that possible, Rolanda? Because they were moving a minute ago. Oh, there we go, I got it, okay. So I mentioned already, I introduced my colleagues and I who worked on this text together. And as I'm continuing to talk about this book and how it came about, I know you are all researchers in your own countries, leading programs and projects. So please do think about and take this in the context of your own experience. I really think we all either have had mentors, and we may not have called them a mentor, which is really important to remember, that we may have people who have guided us in our lives that we haven't referred to as a mentor. But even so, thinking about those people who have really helped us in our lives, professionally or even personally, what does it really take to be a successful mentor and guide junior faculty and colleagues to success? And also to think about, gosh, what do we wish we knew before we started these relationships that might lead to more success? Because this guidebook is really about preparing people before they start relationships, as well as kind of jumping in the middle to improve relationships for success. And so the reason why we've really focused on mentoring and research, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is because we know that when we have a mentor, someone who we're trusted as a counselor or as someone who's guiding us through our career, that provides this mutually beneficial relationship, that we're really able to transfer knowledge from people who are more experienced to someone who's a more junior person. And so that's roughly what I mean when I use the term mentor today, although there's a wide definition of the roles and tasks that it might involve. And so when we were thinking about our programs in Ethiopia, we really wanted to make sure we maximize these benefits to mentees and these junior faculty, right? So we know that mentoring increases knowledge and skills, work satisfaction, promotions, commitment, leadership, networks, and really decreases some of the alienation and isolation that junior faculty or researchers may feel if they don't have someone like a mentor. And so when we were talking about putting together a book, we knew if we could put together a resource that it would be a good long-term return on investment, right? So research shows us that a person who's mentored is more likely to go on and become a mentor themselves. And that's really what we want, right? We want to invest in younger people, knowing that there's, quote unquote, this resonating phenomenon, that if we do well mentoring younger faculty or junior researchers or even healthcare professionals or our staff, that they'll go on to mentors others to build stronger mentoring capacity throughout our institutions and organizations. And we also know that by investing in this process that mentors really benefit too, right? Our research says if we take time to learn the steps to become good mentors, that in fact mentors have better job satisfaction, they're likely to become better leaders, they meet new colleagues, there's better managerial skills, and a lot more recognition and reward for what it is they do in mentoring relationships. So all in all, when we were developing our programs, we knew it was worth putting time into thinking about how to build mentoring for all these positive returns on investments. And so just briefly, I'm going to say, so you all may be familiar with the MEPI program that started first in kind of building medical education in its first phases, and then developed into grants from the Fogarty International Center and the D43 mechanisms, which are research training programs. And so this guidebook came from the MEPI Scholars Junior Faculty Program at Addis Ababa University. And it came from supplemental funding that was specifically focused on building mentoring and leadership capacity. And so this guidebook came from that supplemental program called the MEPI Scholars Clayton DeDonder Mentorship Fellows Program and Global HIV/AIDS Research and Research Training at Addis Ababa University. It's a long title, but part of that was in recognition of receiving the award and what they asked us to include to kind of identify this funding source for this program. So this guidebook came and this program came from the research we had already done in country around what are the needs for mentoring, what are some of the cultural understandings of mentoring, and then how can we take these data and build them into a program that is relevant to the scenario. And so that's where we came up with the MEPI Scholars Program. That was a 6-month mentor training program that taught junior faculty who were HIV/AIDS researchers how to become better mentors. And I should say, as we're teaching people to become better mentors, we're also teaching them how to be great mentees if they're still also mentees, because many of us play this dual role of still being mentored, but also becoming mentors. And I think everything I talk about today speaks to both of those groups of being mentees and mentors. So we had this 6-month program that then led, I'm going to come back to this slide later, that led to this guidebook and a series of lessons that people can now do on your own and in multiple different contexts in Ethiopia and around the world. And I've used these texts actually in Cambodia as well. So what I'd like to do now is I kind of zipped through that background to get to the actual meat of the text. So I can tell you, now that you have this guide, how can you possibly use it in a way that's most productive for you in your own needs and your own context. And I should mention, by the way, all the pictures in this presentation come from that 6-month mentor training program that we did in Addis. So you'll see all the pictures of the mentors and the mentees throughout the entire presentation. So how to take this book and optimize it for your own use. So there are 7 chapters in the text. And they start from the beginning and kind of lead you through the end in the process. And I should say up front that you can pick and choose. You can do all these chapters in order, or you can pick the one that you feel like is resonating with you and you can do them out of order. So they're meant to give you a cohesive experience, but I think that some is better than none. And I know we're all very busy people, so if you're to pick and choose, I think that is beneficial as well. So we start with really some foundational knowledge. Then we talk about setting expectations. We talk about communication. We talk about mentoring different types of trainees with different backgrounds. Then we write a chapter just for mentees. We talk about building capacity and then evaluating mentorship. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these chapters in a minute. I'm sorry, did someone have a question? Okay, so when we wrote this text, it really was with our experience of working with researchers in mind, but we also, the projects with MEPI and then their most recent project, HEPI, the Health Education Partnership Initiative, really works across different types of interprofessional teams. So although this is written with research in mind, it's also written at a level that it can be used with multiple types of audiences. So physicians, healthcare clinic staff, nurses, physician assistants, perhaps community health workers, faculty, students, and also administration. So know that most of the examples are based on the idea of mentoring and research, but they can be used with multiple types of audiences. The skills are all transferable. Also, mentoring, what we'd like to say is not one size fit all, meaning that these are some core concepts in mentoring, but each of these can be tailored to your own mentoring relationships and programs. And where this book is approachable, so it's flexible and it's appropriate for beginners, but also people who have been mentoring for a while. So I think I mentioned some of these things already. So we built this book really thinking about adult learning theory, which says that we should meet people where they're at when they're learning new skills. And so the book shares and displays and explains core concepts in each chapter. But an important part of that work is there's space for each person to answer a set of questions that allows them to apply those concepts to their own experiences. And mentoring is very personal. If each relationship is different, as you know, mentoring involves human beings, and human beings tend to be very messy. And so what we hope is that these chapters provide some kind of core approaches to mentoring that will work across multiple types of mentoring relationships. So there's content, case studies, reflection, skill building activities, and a lot of kind of ways to personalize the material to each individual's mentoring relationships, or to think about it more broadly in terms of how you might apply it to a program. And each chapter includes resources that are online or through the literature that could also tell you more about these topics. So what one way or two ways to think about breaking down the material if you are to organize a group of people or even as an individual to cover the topics in the text is that there's 7 chapters, and I think typically you could either do that in a 7-week period, but more likely you might want to think about spreading this out over an 8-week or an 8-month opportunity where you're meeting regularly, either once a week or once a month, and going through the content over time. And then if that was the case, you might spend your first session really talking about why are you meeting, why is this book important, you know, and kind of what are your goals of going through the curriculum together, what are you hoping for that, and then spending time on each chapter. And then I always really think it's important to think about what are you leaving with. So it's one thing, and again, you can certainly do this text as an individual. I really think that from my experience and training, people enjoy the opportunity to talk about this material with others in a small group. So I encourage that format as well. But that to link this kind of text and this curriculum with some sort of final deliverable, and I'll give you some ideas about that in a minute. So I'm a big proponent of learning for ourselves and disseminating that to as many other people as possible, right? So we can infuse and change our culture around us. Some cautions before beginning. Because there are a lot of activities that ask for self-reflection, I do think it's important to be very mindful of confidentiality. And so for that reason, when you're going through the text, and if you're doing it as a group, really make sure that you're allowing people the decision and the choice to share rather than requiring it. I think there's enough in each chapter that people can share some of their experiences, but there may be other activities that they're still working on personally that they might want to keep to themselves, and that's perfectly okay. Also, just to know that also often when I'm talking about mentoring with people, they are sharing about their relationships, and it can be a very small world, right? So we often are working with the people that we are mentoring for a long time in institutions particularly. And so just to be thoughtful about how we're talking about our colleagues and how we're keeping confidentiality is really important. So if you're able to do this as a group, you might want to think about assigning facilitators for each chapter so that you have different voices leading the sessions. You could also have people work in pairs and go through the text or the curriculum in pairs. You could have a huge group of like 40 to 50 people and then assign smaller groups where they're having discussions about the material. There's also an extensive list of resources and articles in the back of the book. So you could feasibly assign additional articles if you wanted it to be more robust with each topic or each week or month. And again, I also encourage you to think about, how is what you're learning relevant to what you're doing in your own context, institutionally or in your own culture, community, and are there things that you might disagree with, and to have those conversations where you feel like what you're learning does fit your context, or perhaps why you might change or adapt things. I think that's a really important part of the conversation. So when you're talking about implementing the text, I also think, to me, what's really key is to have some sort of determined deliverable at the end. So, for example, in chapter 2, we talk through how to develop an individual development plan, and then how to use those with strong communication tools, or a mentee-mentor agreement. That is something that you could have each participant create or develop or fill out on their own. I've also had people I've worked with who have taken the material and then developed program-wide guidelines for their mentoring program, so that they had some documents to give to other faculty members or junior faculty members about their expectations for their program, something like mentoring best practices. I also think you could ask your participants or the leaders by the end of the curriculum to present back to a larger forum about what you learned and why mentoring might be important. You could develop a series of important topics to continue discussions about mentoring after the curriculum. And then sometimes what we do here in the United States is we kind of make sure we have some award and recognition for people who are working hard on building mentoring, and we have some sort of awards with a very specific criteria, and people are kind of nominated on an annual basis to raise kind of the awareness of mentoring that's happening. So these things are your options, but there's something that allows you to take this curriculum and then say at the end we're going to have these outcomes that will help us sustain some of these practices, and these are some ideas on how you can do that. Okay, so with that big picture in mind of, here's this material we have, here's ways that we might be able to use it in groups, or again, you could do it individually, but I think groups are really effective. Here's how we could spread out the learning over a period of time, be it weeks or a month. And now I've also shared with you how you can attach that learning to some concrete outcomes and expectations that will hopefully shift and change culture in your own research project, a larger program or department, or perhaps even university or institution-wide. So what does that mean then if we're talking about this content in a little bit more detail? So as I mentioned, we really tried to build a text that allowed you to use the chapters on their own, but also in an order that built skills, kind of one set of skills on top of the next, if you do them in the right or the sequence we suggest. There's not a right sequence, but in the sequence we suggest. So in the first chapter is really the most text-heavy chapter. It provides the most content as we really explain what are the kind of core values of mentoring, what are the typical roles and responsibilities of a mentor, and those are based in literature. And then also, how can we think about mentors compared to the other types of professional relationships we have as advisors or supervisors? And then how can we develop mentors based on our own personal strengths that contribute to mentoring relationships? And so in this chapter, we go through some of the characteristics that lead to good mentoring and explain what those mean. And I should mention that some of the research on mentoring really shows that there are kind of core values in mentoring, and that those core values will create positive mentoring across a number of different types of relationships, right? So if you have kind of these core values and these core concepts, you should be able to use those to mentor a multitude of different types of people. And so we articulate some of the different functions of For example, a research mentor, which is a mentor who helps very specifically in an expertise of a certain area, or something like a career mentor, and you might want both of these, right? We talk about the advantages of mentoring teams too. How career mentors may help you overall making career decisions, but may not have some of the content or the nitty-gritty details of your research area that your research mentor might have, and why these things are important to consider when you're thinking about mentors. So this chapter really does flush out the different types of mentoring, the roles and responsibilities associated with those, and how you might be able to become a mentor with your own skills. I also think this is a really important activity in this first chapter to set up why and how mentoring is important in your own context. So in Ethiopia, for example, we started our training with our mentors and mentees, talking about and fleshing out why there are different roles. Like it's more typical maybe to have an advisor or a supervisor in many Ethiopian research contexts, and how that is the same or different than a mentor, so that we were clear when we're talking about mentorship, kind of the parameters of that relationship. So this activity could be changed. I know in the US we talk a lot about sponsors and coaches as well as kind of a mentoring type of relationship. So you could see here in this activity, it might be that you have different terms or different types of roles you might compare a mentor to. But this is a really nice discussion at the beginning to talk about all the ways you're leading more junior people in their careers and what you call those roles and what you specifically want in your idea of mentorship. In the second chapter, we talk more about how you need to set expectations in the beginning of a relationship. I will say overall, most mentoring relationships that don't work is because there's been a misunderstanding from the beginning about what that relationship is supposed to be. And so in chapter 2, we give you tools to very clearly communicate between mentors and mentees what's expected. So many of you have probably heard of and used individual development plans, which allows a mentee to very clearly articulate their short and long-term goals, the skills they have to meet those goals, the skills they still need to meet those goals, and then their very specific career plans that you can hold them accountable for. And so this chapter goes into depth and gives some examples of individual development plans, as well as agreements that mentors and mentees can create to guide their relationships. And again, I think what's important about this chapter is saying, if we're deliberate from the beginning of mentoring, we are more likely to have successful outcomes because we have clarified any kind of hidden assumptions we have about that relationship and what we expect. And like I mentioned, most people I work with, when problems arise, it's because the mentors expected one thing and the mentees expected another thing, and then a disagreement happened because those things had never been talked about. And so any way that you can from the beginning be clear about your expectations will help your mentoring relationship. And that's what this chapter focuses on, is how can I from the beginning develop a strong foundation, develop the purpose of my relationship and be clear about that with a mentee, and then hold accountability between the mentors and the mentees based on these tools we have that have carefully outlined this relationship. Also, these tools you can return to throughout your mentoring relationship to make sure you're staying on track and you're evaluating the relationship. And so in this chapter, we give you several examples as well as resources online that show you a multitude of ways to develop these tools. We also, in this chapter, give you case studies where you can take what it is we've shared with you about how to be successful with setting expectations and then solve a very typical mentoring problem based on the use of these tools and how to use them. So again, this idea that we're presenting with you with ideas on how to improve mentoring and then applying them through solving case studies or having certain types of conversations with your colleagues. After chapter 2 and kind of the core foundations of setting your expectations, we talk you through some tips on communication and what works best to make sure that you are articulating those goals that you set out, right, with each other, and also how it is you can throughout your, because sometimes mentoring is, you know, a short period of time, but many times mentoring is, you know, a lifetime of experiences depending on what you're looking for. And so our communication chapter tells you how to have different strategies to communicate with a broad variety of mentees. We start by kind of sharing how you can do a self-assessment of your own communication style. We give you a number of websites that offer free assessments to understand how it is you might typically communicate, and then how it is you might communicate different than your mentees. And if in fact you have a difference of communication style, how you bridge that gap. We go over some concrete skills such as implementing communication strategies for productive mentorship meetings, right? We describe how it is you can be more effective in giving feedback that is utilizable to your mentee. We talk about different listening strategies that might allow you to understand your mentee and what it is they need from you or they're asking for. And we also talk about when there is tension, and perhaps if your mentee has not given or met their deliverables or not doing what they're supposed to, how do you have these difficult conversations so that they're productive? So I think many times, again, in mentoring relationships, when there is a problem, perhaps from not setting up your expectations in the beginning, kind of that next step is really communicating, how do we work through a challenge? You know, most mentorships, a lot of them work, most of them work really well, and that involves some tough conversations around telling a mentee how to improve or asking them to do better, or them having to communicate a problem they're having to you. And having some skills around how to do that with less conflict is really helpful. And that's what this chapter does, is it tries to give you a toolbox of different ways you can communicate to be more effective. And of course, ultimately, what we all hope from this is that it saves you time. I haven't mentioned that yet, but that is a big impetus for a book like this, is how can you do work up front so that it saves you time later? Because poor mentoring relationships, as many of you might know, take an enormous amount of your time. And you are all very busy people, so anything you can do up front to minimize the time later will be beneficial. So setting expectations and communications are two big areas that will help you with that. Oops. Okay. So I think I talked about this already, that chapter 3 goes through communication style assessments, productive meetings, giving feedback, difficult conversations, and asks you to think about and reflect on your own communication style. Let me stop and say this is also really important. There is not one best communication style. We need many types of communication styles to succeed. Most of us work in teams. There's not one way that works, but what's important is we realize how we all communicate differently and how we can be flexible to relate to each other for success. And so knowing how you communicate and observing how others communicate can lead you to better productivity. So this activity here is really sharing the different ways that you can communicate, and then the activity asks you to journal over a week or two about what styles or what approaches you used, how well they worked, where were you flexible, what did you try that was new, and how did it work? So again, sharing with you strategies and then asking you to apply them in your mentoring relationships or in your everyday life to see how they're working so that you can do a better job at it. There's also additional case studies in here that you can apply. So there's probably 5 activities in every chapter that allow you to apply the skills you've learned through the text. So after getting through some core concepts, we dive into a little bit about diversity and how it is we may have implicit bias. And just to stop and talk a minute about that, we do talk a lot about this in the United States. We've done a lot of work in Ethiopia, thinking about gender and mentoring women as we're, the MEPI program in particular, one of their core aims is to increase the number of women in the biomedical workforce and becoming researchers. So what does that mean to really think about mentoring across gender? And in the United States, we talk a lot about mentoring scholars who are first generation, so the first from their family who are even educated. And what does that mean to help mentor people who are the first ones in their family to have an education, to become researchers? What unique needs might they have? And so how we describe implicit bias in the United States is that oftentimes, even in the face of our very good intentions to help our mentees, we make assumptions about them that sometimes are counter to what we're really hoping to do for them in terms of their success. And so this chapter really goes through and talks about how can we be inclusive in our mentoring. And this term, kind of inclusive mentoring, means how can we deliberately think about supporting women or people from certain ethnic groups or people who were the first ones to be educated in their families? What strategies might we use to really support those people to succeed? Because we know that in research and science, the more diverse perspectives we have, the better our science, right? So it's to all of our advantages to make sure we have diverse research teams so we have better science. And so this chapter has a glossary of terms that really talks about the different types of bias we might unknowingly hold and act on, and how to think about questioning that bias and really making sure that we're able to successfully mentor very different types of trainees. And just one more point on this, I can speak from the context in Ethiopia and the US. I'm not sure, it's different wherever you're working, but in the US, we know we need men to mentor women because there are not as many women in leadership roles here. So it won't always be a woman mentoring a woman. Like, that's just not really possible given the few amount of women in leadership roles. That's also true in Ethiopia. And so it is really important that we're able to mentor different types of people, right, for success. So this chapter talks about terms, awareness, the benefits of diversity in teams and mentoring, a little bit about recognizing implicit bias, and again, some case studies that we find are kind of typical, where we see, again, despite people's very good intentions, that bias can influence the type of advice they're giving to mentees. Okay, so that leaves us up to chapter 5, which is specifically written for your mentees. However, there's a lot of great content in here for mentors too. But if you are currently mentoring or you're about to start a mentoring relationship, this is a great chapter you can pull out and give to your mentee. Some of it is very personal, so they may not, again, want to share some of the responses to their questions or the activities with you, but you could certainly have a conversation about some of the content. This is a very US context, but we've been talking a lot about this in ADDIS too. In the US, we have a lot of expectations for the mentees to initiate some of the relationships and really to manage some of the relationship. In ADDIS, there's different feelings about that because it's out of respect that a mentee is a lot less likely to perhaps initiate some of the mentoring behaviors or the mentoring relationships. And we've had a lot of conversations about that. That's something that needs to be figured out in each individual context. I will say in the US, we as busy people, we encourage mentees to take on a role of responsibility in the relationship to relieve the mentors of some of those tasks, which then allows the mentors to have more time to mentor more people. So we talk about kind of the balance of how mentees can initiate or take responsibility for parts of that relationship in this chapter, and also how it is on them to follow through on the tasks the mentors ask them to do. So this really is a helpful chapter where we start by talking about what kind of mentors might they want, what is their responsibility in this relationship, how can they be sure to be prepared and effective in these relationships, because again, if the mentees are not being effective, that puts a very big burden on the mentor. So we need the mentees to be effective as possible. We kind of give them ideas on how they can be doing a good job at completing their IDP. So from their end, what do they need to do before a mentor reviews it? And also to suggest to them some ways that they could avoid possible areas of conflict, again, to save time and have more productive relationships. So after that chapter on the mentees, a little bit of focus on them, we pull it out again to say, okay, you've had all these chapters that have built kind of individual skills and strengthened your relationships. However, this needs to happen in this larger picture of an institution or a research project that supports a culture of mentoring, right? It needs to be recognized and incentivized. And so in chapter 6, it really talks you through some very specific concrete steps of how you can kind of formalize your mentoring relationships or a program. And many of you may be familiar with the social ecological model. We talk about this a lot in public health. And this chapter really dives into how can we influence and promote better mentoring at multiple levels. So individual level, relationship level, institutional level, and policies that support and build a culture of mentoring. There are multiple learning objectives in this chapter. It really, again, it provides you with 11 steps on how to build your program, identifying how mentoring supports your organization, listing what you want from your mentoring program, how do you develop criteria to select mentors and mentees, what resources are available already for your program, what barriers might you need to overcome with mentoring, and what facilitators exist. And then how do you evaluate your mentorship to make sure that it's working well? Here are the 11 steps. And again, there's activities that support each step. And you can do this in your groups or individually to think about how you have more sustainable mentoring from a larger scale perspective in your, again, research project, program, department, school. And then the last chapter is thinking from the beginning, if you're putting all this effort into building mentorship, how do you evaluate and know that you succeed? So this chapter provides you with, again, a number of steps and tools on how it is you can evaluate the programs you have implemented and the mentoring you have implemented. It tells you a little bit about evaluation. It tells you the domains or metrics you could evaluate for your programs and gives you resources. And it gives you some websites that show some very concrete examples of how people measure mentoring in their institutions. Here are the actual steps here you can see in this visual. And I guess what I would just note from this is that it's never too early to start thinking about evaluation. The mistake you might know from your own research and your own programming, as well as here in the United States, we often get to the end of the program and realize we should have been evaluating it all the way along. So I really encourage you from the beginning to think about allocating some resources on how to evaluate your implementation of this book and mentoring, to perhaps seek an evaluator to work with who could give you some advice or support, have small amount of resources that allow you to conduct focus groups, interviews, surveys to evaluate your mentorship. And then also, just like I mentioned in the beginning, that mentoring is very personal. So thinking about how you'll protect people's confidentiality while you will indeed evaluate what you're doing. And again, I think whatever it is you do, it is really important to share your findings and your experiences with others so that you're improving mentoring in your own context and also disseminating that more broadly. Okay, and that really leads us to the end of the text, which provides additional resources. Quite frankly, each one of these chapters could have been an entire book. There's a lot written about these topics. We tried to pick the most important things that we thought people should know when they were implementing mentoring. But the resources are quite extensive, and they provide resources, additional literature and research on all of these topics that you see in front of you. Mentoring in global settings with diverse trainees, medical students specifically, women, peer mentoring programs, which are really important, as well as some specific literature written for mentees. And then I just want to mention to you as I'm wrapping up, and I'd love to take your questions, our kind of next steps. We're thinking about whether it's worth pulling out and doing a supplemental chapter specifically on gender. We get a lot of questions about this. So we have a committee right now in Ethiopia on women research and mentoring, where we feel like we might be able to pull out more structured guidance on mentoring women. Also, I think with in many settings where there are limited amount of senior faculty to become mentors, that peer mentoring has been a very positive step forward. So at Addis Ababa University, after our mentoring program, I know one of our trainees started a peer mentoring program for our women who were in residency. And again, that relieves some of the burden on senior researchers, faculty, healthcare professionals, if peers are very deliberate about mentoring each other. And then it's possible we could write more concrete guidance on how to have mentoring relationships, across countries, communities, when people aren't able to meet in person, when there's just not enough mentors available, and to build mentoring capacity that way. And then my own goal is also just to be able to develop a set of PowerPoints for each chapter that might allow you to guide the chapters, as well as, for example, the slides I provide you today. So that's a lot. I've been talking at you for a while. Thank you so much for listening, but I would love to take any questions you have or any comments about the test or ideas for next step. I'm very open to hearing your feedback.
Thanks so much, Dawn. This is really amazing. So we are open for questions. You can also write in the chat box, and then I will just read out the question. For those of you who might not have microphone.
Yeah, and while people are writing, I guess that's because I just feel like I gave you a lot of information. I really do want to say that I think the book is very doable. It sounds like a lot when I present it in a huge chunk like this, but it is really designed to be approachable and doable. So I think if you break it down chapter by chapter, it's very easy to use.
All right, so we have a question from David.
Okay.
I don't know whether the book covers this. What's the best way to start a mentorship program in a group that is already closely knit? Research institute of less than 50 people. There's already a good lateral relationship between MSc students, PhD students, postdocs, and most supervisors. It may seem fairly straightforward to introduce formal mentorship in such a setting. However, is it possible that introducing a formal mentorship program could reduce the freedom with which one interacts with a mentor that they were open with before?
That is such a great question. Yes, so I mean, I would have to know a little bit more, but I would say yes, it could reduce the freedom. So just from the small amount you shared, I think, it's really hard because I guess this is just my public health hat. I might try to do some sort of a little bit of a needs assessment first, so whether it's some informal surveying or meetings or, not even the formal structure of a focus group, but a little bit more like a little bit looser than that, just kind of feeling out where people might need additional support if their needs aren't met. I think you could also think about you could also have so mentoring is not required in my department. I'm just going to mention that. In some programs, it's required. We have to opt into it. So I need to say as a faculty member, I would like a mentor, and the mentors have to agree to be mentors. And so in that way, you might be able to allow the freedom that you have to continue if that's successful, and then offer starting at a very, so I would start small. I think that's the other really important thing. Start small, right? Offer out to a few, maybe some of the postdocs or some of your graduate students, are you interested in a more formal relationship? Could it be in addition to the ones they already have, or maybe it's formalizing one they have? and then see how that goes, you know, kind of monitor that over time. Again, I don't know your specific context, but some of the research on mentorship, when we talk about evaluating it, and this is just, I think, maybe in general for more junior folks, they are less likely to say they are dissatisfied with the situation they have. So sometimes offering something and seeing if they take that offer may indicate a need that they might not be comfortable actually articulating to you. And so that's how we've approached it here is, and honestly, some mentors hate the tools. I'm going to be quite frank with you. They don't want to have a formal structured relationship. But then what we've found is that when you dig a little deeper, the mentors will say things like, well, I never had an IDP until this student published a paper and didn't put my name on it. Or I never had a mentor-mentee agreement until the student stopped, you know, coming to class or stopped going to my research lab, and I had no way to hold them accountable. So unfortunately, sometimes people end up formalizing those relationships after things go wrong. But I do think that your observation that something is working well and you don't want to jeopardize that is an important one. So I would do kind of an and both and start at a very small scale and see if there's a need or a desire for something like this. I hope that helps. Please let me know if there's more I can say on that or another question.
So David just says, thanks. Are there any other questions? Hold on, I have a question. I just wanted to find out or poke your brain about this. Do you think study supervisors can be good mentors or make good mentors in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, they can be. And I think, you know, one of the things also we've been thinking about at the MEPI programs in Ethiopia is that what we've found as we've been talking about mentoring a lot in these programs is that supervisors are becoming more like mentors, you know, and so the supervisors who now are learning about mentoring are incorporating mentoring behaviors into their supervisory roles, which I think is great. Again, I think an and both approach is really helpful across the board here. But I think what's different, and one thing to consider, and I actually almost mentioned this earlier, is there are power dynamics. So for example, I'll just use my example from my own career. My chair of my department is also my mentor, right? I need to have other mentors who are not in that who are not my chair, because if someone like a supervisor is making a decision about your promotion, how much money you make, access to opportunities, you know, it's a lot harder for a mentee perhaps to be honest about some of their mistakes. And so, yes, but at the same time, you want someone like a supervisor to be able to advocate for you when you're doing well and they really know your work. So they can do some mentoring behaviors that can really be an advantage. I think that person who's more junior needs to make sure they have perspective from another mentor. Maybe it's not someone they meet with as often, or again, doesn't know the details of their work, but can give them some more unbiased information and guidance on decisions about their career. Because let's be real, you know, a supervisor does have an impact on a junior person's career, right? So it's not a yes or a no, it's just a little trickier, and there's some things that need to be considered in that relationship. You know, we tend to think of mentoring as being a lot more mutual and reciprocal than a traditional supervisor, you know, supervisee relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. Yes, that is very true. Because also you feel sometimes you would burden your supervisor by also him acting or him or her acting as a mentor role. So it is, you have to choose also what you want out of the relationship.
Yeah, that is true. And I think, you know, sometimes, you know, I have mentors I talk to only twice a year or I'll have some that are so busy and I just know, like, when I'm at a critical point, I need to see them. And then there's other mentors I see casually and regularly, and that's okay. You know, I think You can have mentors that are just available, a couple of times a year for your major decisions. And then you can have mentors that help you in more of your day-to-day professional life.
Mm-hmm. Priscilla, do you have a question? Priscilla, we can't hear you. Do you mind typing the question? I'm not sure if Priscilla is busy typing the question, but I can ask another question.
Okay.
No, I simply asked because this H3Africa consortium is quite large. And I was wondering your take, because I see you did mentor to write a supplementary chapter on e-mentoring. Do you think that is really feasible in the long run? And does it really then require some face-to-face time, even if it is once a year or so? Do you think it will actually?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a really important point. So some people have had some very good success with e-mentoring. I think a lot of it is also personality driven. I like being in person. I'm not as good. I mean, I'm just saying up front, like I just really like the in-person contact. I think it is hard. It's not the same thing, but I do think it is one way to supplement knowledge and guidance. Like I think it is feasible. I think it does help. It's just not the same as the in-person, but I don't think that means it's not worth doing. So in other words, kind of like I was saying about this book, I think some is probably better than none. And I think with e-mentoring, I think the key is I've actually been writing about this for something else that I'm hoping to publish soon. There's some different strategies that mentors, they need to adopt their expectations. So I find that a lot of times with e-mentoring, it's much more around skill building and technical assistance. Like that seems to be done well over e-mentoring, right? Because you can talk very specifically about concrete skills or questions you have. It's a lot more challenging though to mentor in the area of something like overall long-term career goals, because often that e-mentor isn't in that local context and does not have the information to really know what some of the best career options are or decision making. And so I think there are like if the mentoring is around a specific research project's expertise, methods, or resources, then I think the e-mentoring can be really successful. But it's the local in-country mentors who know much more about the cultural environment and the politics, right, of how you have to succeed. Like, what do you have to know? The informal knowledge is what we call it here. Things that aren't written in a book, but you need to know to make it in your institution. A lot of times the mentors, they don't understand that part. So I would really optimize the e-mentoring around very specific tasks and goals, reviewing manuscripts, reviewing grants, helping them find funding resources. Like that's all stuff people can do from the distance.
Oh, okay. That's
but
really useful
like work-life
information.
balance, a little bit harder to understand, right? Across cultures, it's really hard to know, that comfort level of what you want to share with somebody when you're talking with them on video calls. But I think the technical part can be done well.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Are there any other questions from anyone? Any questions from a mentee perspective? Well, all right, Dawn. If there's no other questions, I don't think we should keep you much longer.
Okay, yeah.
Yes?
Hello, sorry.
Sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I just have a quick one.
No
Okay, so
problem.
most mentorships that I'm involved in, they started organically. Yeah, and there's always this challenge of how do you then formalize them? Because I mean, you also want to have clear expectations, as you have indicated, and also some timelines. So how do we bridge that? Because it's almost like it's you approaching someone, you develop a friendship or a relationship, then you start to benefit from there. But the moment you now want to, I mean, it's easier to formalize supervision, but the mentorship is almost like organic. I mean, someone is maybe interested to see you develop better, and yeah, it might be either way. Someone just be interested in you, so it's just like organic. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, and I think, again, well, first of all, how great that it happens organically. I think many places it doesn't. So if it does, I think that's great. And I would, if you can, really take note of how and when that happens. So it becomes formal knowledge, not just informal knowledge. Like, why does it work? And does everyone benefit the same from that type of organic mentorship? It might be true in your case. I know in our case, for example, one of the reasons why we have tried to be more clear about formally offering mentoring is that research in the United States shows our junior faculty and postdocs and our graduate students, if they are the first one coming from families where they have not, like my parents didn't go to college, for example, the first generation folks are less likely to seek out guidance from people. They're much more hesitant to ask for what they need. And so our response to that is to offer it to everyone in hopes that they feel more comfortable asking for what they need. Some definitely happen organically. And again, it might be very different in your context, but just something to be aware of is that our backgrounds as individuals do affect how much we take advantage of relationships professionally. I think the other thing is that the IDP, we've had a very positive response to that, because that's really the mentee, even in an informal relationship, being concrete about their goals. So that is, we kind of liken it to, when you have a lot to do, you make a list and you check it off. And psychology tells us if you write down your goals, you're more likely to achieve them. So I think an IDP sounds very formal, but it can be used informally, and they can easily just share with a mentor, here are the ideas of things I'd like to do, what do you think? And the mentor can share that, and it's just one way to hold people to a timeline. It depends on your setting. We often work with trainees who are on a very tight timeline for their deliverables, and so an IDP really helps. It may not be necessary in a more long-term, less deadline-driven environment. And again, I just have to say, some mentors in the US really don't like some of these forms, but then we have a large contingency of mentees who really find them helpful because they're very bashful about mentioning when they want more or maybe even want less. So sometimes these tools make it less personal between the two people and make it more about the objectives of what the career goals are.
All right. Thanks so much, Dawn. I think we've reached the hour now, and I can see a lot of people are dropping off the call.
Yeah, well, please reach out if you want more information, share the book with others, and thank you everyone for joining. I know we lost a few, but I'm thrilled we had as many people as we did.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm sure everybody has a takeaway message here.
Yes, and also if we go to influentialmentors.com, anyone can download the book for free. So please send people there if you need them to find more information.
I will do so.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good afternoon. Bye.